The world has finally reacted, and the payback is being planned in the most powerful corridors of the planet. Donald Trump believed he could threaten allies, invade neighboring nations, and redraw the global map through fear. But he made a fatal mistake. He united the world against himself. What you are about to see now is the coordinated revenge of leaders who are tired of being held hostage by a predatory regime. From European war plans to deter American incursions to economic alliances designed to isolate Washington, the circle is closing. This is an investigation into how democratic powers decided that Trump is the largest threat to the survival of the West and how they are acting to neutralize him. It is fundamental to highlight that all official sources and reports cited in this analysis are available in the description of this video. Before revealing this bombshell, leave your like and subscribe. The fact is that the world reached a breaking point in January 2026. At the Élysée Palace, French President Emmanuel Macron broke decades of protocol by openly denouncing Donald Trump's regime as the personification of the law of the strongest. Macron did not mince words when citing Trump's real threats regarding the annexation of Greenland and the absurd rhetoric of turning Canada into the 51st American state. As an immediate response, France raised its defense budget to historical levels and summoned a coalition of nations to ensure that Europe is no longer a hostage to Washington's whims. In my analysis, what we are seeing is the end of the United States' moral leadership. Analysts point out that by treating sovereign nations like real estate properties, Trump destroyed the predictability that held the global balance together. Europe understood that supposed American protection became a tool for extortion. The risk here is the total collapse of NATO from within, transforming the continent into an independent and armed military bloc. The scenario indicates that the contingency plan for a world without the United States is already underway. If Washington tries to advance upon the sovereignty of Canada or Denmark, the response will not be merely diplomatic, but an unprecedented economic and military isolation against the Americans. When a leader decides to treat the world as his private board game, he ends up discovering that no one accepts being a piece in a tyrant's game. The fact is that Washington's aggressiveness forced an unprecedented defensive union in the Northern Hemisphere. In January 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz issued a joint declaration reaffirming unwavering support for Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. This movement occurs in direct response to Donald Trump's insistent statements that Canada should be the 51st American state and that control of Greenland is a matter of United States national security. To reinforce this barrier, Canada announced a historical increase in defense spending, raising the budget to 5% of GDP and creating a reserve force of 300,000 soldiers, focused exclusively on the protection of the Arctic, NATO's western flank. This movement indicates that Western democracies have abandoned the diplomacy of courtesy to adopt the strategy of force. The Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, echoed this sentiment by defending that true peace is only guaranteed by deterrence, the capacity to be strong enough to make an enemy retreat. The facts show that Europe and Canada no longer consider Trump's threats as mere campaign jokes, but as real plans for territorial expansion. The risk here is an irreversible fracture in global security. The scenario points to a militarization of the Arctic, where historical allies, such as Germany and the United Kingdom, are willing to confront the American presence to ensure that international borders are respected. When the White House treats allies as prey, it forces them to unite to hunt down who should have been their protector. The fact is that Donald Trump's aggressiveness against his northern and southern neighbors triggered a movement of financial self-defense that could be the coup de grace to American hegemony. After the threats of territorial annexation, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Chancellor Friedrich Merz formalized a strategic alliance to strengthen Euro-Atlantic security, but the true impact is in trade. The European Union and the largest economies in Latin America have just ratified a gigantic trade pact, creating a free trade zone of 700 million people that completely ignores the United States. While Washington imposes aggressive tariffs against the world, the rest of the planet is eliminating barriers among themselves, isolating the American market on an island of self-imposed protectionism. This movement is not just a dispute over taxes, but a coordinated flight from the dollar. By using the currency as a political weapon and threatening the sovereignty of nations like Canada, The Trump regime accelerated the transition to alternative payment systems that would previously have taken decades to consolidate. The risk here is a brutal erosion of purchasing power within the United States. The scenario indicates that, as the world stops using the dollar to buy oil and industrial goods, American domestic inflation could spiral out of control, transforming the promise of prosperity into a catastrophic economic isolation. The world has learned that it cannot trust a currency that serves the whims of a government that threatens to invade its own trading partners. Global revenge is being served in exchange rate tables and agreements that simply scratch the United States off the map of priorities. The fact is that Donald Trump's military incursion into Venezuela handed the perfect scenario for the advancement of authoritarian powers on a silver platter. While Washington focused all its energies on capturing Nicolas Maduro and controlling oil reserves in January 2026, Russia took advantage of the vacuum of attention and the suspension of American air defense missile shipments to massacre Ukraine. Reports confirm that while the United States redirected resources to the Caribbean, Moscow launched the Oreshnik hypersonic missile against Lviv, hitting critical infrastructure just a few kilometers from the NATO border. At the same time, China watches with satisfaction the exhaustion of the American armed forces in a costly occupation in Latin America, gaining free ground to consolidate its influence in the Pacific and in Taiwan. This movement reveals a brutal strategic error that many analysts call Trump's gift to Putin. By withholding Patriot missiles and vital munitions that should have protected Kyiv to prioritize his adventure in Venezuela, the Trump regime left Europe vulnerable and signaled that the sovereignty of allies is negotiable. The facts show that China and Russia did not feel intimidated. On the contrary, they saw in American aggressiveness a license to ignore international law. The risk here is a coordinated global escalation. The scenario indicates that while the United States sinks into a war of occupation in the Western Hemisphere, the rest of the democratic world is being left to its own devices against Russian missiles and Chinese expansion. Revenge against democracies is being facilitated by Trump's own obsession with acting as a regional predator, abandoning the global board to his greatest rivals. The fact is that the Trump regime crossed the red line of international sovereignty with the execution of Operation Absolute Resolve. On January 3, 2026, United States Special Forces invaded Venezuelan territory, captured Nicolas Maduro, and transported him to New York to face trial. In a press conference on the same day, Trump was explicit in declaring that the United States will command Venezuela until his administration decides that a safe transition has been completed. Simultaneously, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, denounced the actions of American immigration agents, ICE, comparing them to Nazi brigades for pursuing and killing Latin American and even American citizens on United States soil. In response to this imperialist posture, Brazil and Colombia initiated high-level talks to form a regional defense front against foreign interventions. This posture reveals that the White House has abandoned any facade of multilateral diplomacy in favor of aggressive territorial control. By stating that Washington now dictates the rules in Caracas, Trump validated the worst fears of his allies, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is the private property of the American regime. The facts show that this policy did not bring stability. On the contrary, it generated a diplomatic revolt across the continent. The risk here is a coordinated regional insurgency. The scenario points to a total diplomatic isolation of the United States in Latin America, where previously friendly countries now seek military alliances with Europe and China to protect themselves from what they call the empire of chaos. When the leader of the world's greatest power decides to ignore borders, he transforms neighbors into vigilant enemies who will not rest until balance is restored. The fact is that not even the sector Donald Trump claims to protect is willing to support his vision of absolute dominance. After the occupation of Venezuela, the CEO of ExxonMobil and other leaders of the oil industry sent a clear warning: Venezuela is not a country for investment under current conditions. Despite Trump's promise that oil would flow freely to the United States, energy giants made it clear that more than $100 billion in federal subsidies and drastic structural changes would be necessary to make Venezuelan infrastructure minimally functional. Furthermore, companies fear the instability of a government managed directly by Washington, preferring to keep their operations in regions where market rules are not altered by impulsive presidential decrees. This corporate resistance reveals a critical flaw in the regime's strategy: the belief that military force can replace market confidence. By trying to force companies to operate in a territory under illegal occupation, Trump created a scenario of economic uncertainty that drives away capital. The facts show that while Washington tries to subsidize dirty and expensive to refine oil, China is closing long-term deals with Canada and other stable producers, guaranteeing the energy supply for the future. The risk here is a massive drain of American public resources to sustain an occupation that the energy companies themselves consider a strategic error. The scenario indicates that the victory in Venezuela could become the greatest financial loss in United States history, isolating the country in a sector where it once dominated through efficiency and not through brute force. The market's revenge is silent, but fatal for those who ignore the laws of economics in the name of a project for personal power. The fact is that the Trump regime turned truth into a negotiable commodity through the uncontrolled use of generative artificial intelligence. In January 2026, technical reports confirmed that the American government issued executive orders to overturn state regulations that attempted to label deepfakes and punish digital misinformation. During the invasion of Venezuela, Donald Trump himself amplified hyper-realistic videos showing massive celebrations in the streets that never occurred, while AI tools were used to flood social networks with fabricated evidence of imminent threats to justify attacks on other countries. At the same time, the federal government began the dismantling of fact-checking agencies, classifying any attempt at verification as ideological censorship. This posture reveals that the strategy for maintaining power now depends on the total destruction of shared reality. By allowing algorithms to create a constant fog of war, the regime prevents the common citizen, and even foreign governments, from being able to distinguish between a real military operation and a digital simulation. The facts show that China and Russia are already utilizing this same loophole to launch their own misinformation campaigns within the United States, taking advantage of the fact that Trump's only rule is the absence of rules. The risk here is the collapse of democratic institutions. The scenario indicates that the 2026 midterm elections will be the most chaotic in history, where fake videos of candidates committing crimes will be impossible to debunk in time. The revenge against the truth is the final pillar of this investigation, showing that for a regime that does not respect physical borders, the borders of logic are just another obstacle to be destroyed. The circle is closing and the world will not be the same after 2026. The question that remains is, how far will this disorder take us? If you value the truth and want to continue following the behind-the-scenes stories that the mainstream media ignores, your action is fundamental. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like to strengthen our community against misinformation. Share this video so more people understand what is at stake. The sources are in the description. Until the next investigation.